also very practical, and it's a prospectus really for moving the profession forward. So why would we need something like the Melbourne Mandate? Well, first of all, it takes an advocacy position, and it's not just for people within the profession. The goal is really to construct something, that would be helpful for public relations to professionals to advocate to others, particularly business leaders, political leaders, the value of public relations, to make the case for public relations to organisations. And it was an amazing process. We'll take you through the process because we believe that the role of public relations in society is becoming more and more important. And this is a lasting legacy for the profession from Melbourne in 2012, and it built on the Stockholm Accords, more of which later, which were the result of the Stockholm World Public Relations Forum in 2010.
Okay, so, pardon me. There we go. So we all know that the world in which we're communicating is changing dramatically, and it's important to understand the political, the economic, the technological, the cultural, the social context of change. And we see from these images, some of the images that we saw as we were developing the Melbourne Mandate and preparing for it in Australia last year. We've gone from a global economic crisis to a fiscal crisis in many countries, and not surprisingly, the result of austerity, a social crisis as well. And it's useful perhaps to think about back to 2010, the last time the Global Alliance came together at a World Public Relations Forum. Anne mentioned, we heard from Dr. Klaus Schwab, CEO of the World Economic Forum, and he made some very powerful points which really helped, I think, us to conceptualize some of the things that we wanted to do in Melbourne. He talked about factors driving change in the world that were particularly relevant for public relations practitioners and communicators. He talked about time compression, the fact that we've had to digest more in one generation than previous generations had to do in 100 years or more. Think of genomics or the internet as just a couple of examples. The increasing complexity of issues, the fact that the World Economic Forum at the time had a list of 78 major threats facing the world. The unprecedented interconnectivity and interdependence of issues. The fact that a bank collapse on Wall Street can cause unemployment in a village in China or in northern England. And so finally, the idea that there's been a change of context, a change of power structure in the world, and we hear much about the shift of power from west to east, from north to south, but the one that's really been preoccupying me and preoccupying the Global Alliance is the shift that we're all experiencing in communication power from organizations to their audiences. As we all walk around as citizens, as consumers, as shareholders, with global publishing power in our pockets. And so that profoundly changes the dynamic for communications and for organizations. We've moved really from an age of value chains to an age of value networks. And the result is the consumer's decisions are less linear than they ever have been before, shaped by an incredible range of different factors and different types of capital, social and relationship capital chief among them. And of course, we've also seen a change in influence and even critiques, very, very sophisticated critiques and powerful critiques of the media itself. Here are some images around Occupy Wall Street from last year, and there's a critique of the New York Times and the way its coverage of Occupy Wall Street shifted over the course of 20 minutes in covering a protest on the Brooklyn Bridge. So we're in a very different environment, as we all know.
evolution of market value over this last period. In 1975, if you valued a company, you can see there that over 75% of its, 83% of its value in fact, was about its physical and financial assets. And just a small percentage, 17%, were about other factors. We might call that brand. But now in 2009, we see a complete reversal of that, where the physical and financial assets of an organization are now only worth on average about 19% of its value. And 81% of its value are therefore around intangibles, which includes the value put on the brand, the intellectual capability of the organization, its knowledge resources, etc. And we would argue that that is our territory. That's where public relations needs to operate. Discussion about brand and the quality of intellectual thinking is all about communicative activity of the organization, and therefore that's the territory that we need to move into. And you can see that this slide was given to us by the Integrated Reporting Council, in fact the International Integrated Reporting Council, because just yesterday Dan and I were involved in a launch of a consultation of a document which looks at the way that organisations report their performance. And there needs to be a shift in the reporting of performance away from an emphasis on how organisations have performed in the past and away from financial projections and financial analysis into a much more holistic process, where the value of an organisation to society is discussed in the round. And very interestingly, apart from what we might regard as the more traditional capitals of finance and manufactured capital within the organisation, the Integrated Reporting Initiative suggests that we focus on 6 capitals, and 3 of those are very much around communication. One is the communication of human worth and human contribution to organisations. And as we know, organisations meet their objectives through people, and therefore that's something for us to be deeply involved in. And internal communications, as we know, is zooming up the agenda of importance for organisational chiefs, and the reason for that is because there's a recognition that human capital at the end of the day, now since 1975, has such incredible importance. Another capital that they talk about is a social and relational capital. And if we think about the valuation of a brand, that's really about the relationship that a brand has with its stakeholders who have a stranglehold on its destiny. That's very much our territory. And another capital they talk about is intellectual capital. That is only worth anything when it's communicated, when groups of people get together to discuss ideas and when those ideas are communicated. So you can see that in the world of finance and integrated reporting, there's a complete shift and an opportunity for us to move into a space that has been traditionally occupied very much by financial directors. And certainly in the discussions of the launch that I was at yesterday, there was even discussion about the composition of the board and whether or not the right people were there, and the balance of people around the board needs to change to reflect the new world in which we find ourselves.
So the other milestone, which is astonishing in human history, is the potential that we face in the years ahead, where virtually every human being on the planet is connected to virtually every other. Obviously, we're never going to get universal connection, but we get closer and closer and closer every year. And this really enables, in the words of the Arthur Page Society, the potential for advocacy at scale, one-to-one advocacy and relationship building with individual members of the audience. And so it's less talking to a speaker talking to an audience as it is one-to-one communication. And so this too changes the way that we do business. And so that leads me to a few paradoxes. There's a paradox of complexity, the fact that we understand complexity, and we're getting more sophisticated as consumers in the way we evaluate claims that organizations make, marketing and through communications. At the same time, we crave simplicity, and there's so much clutter out there, there's so much information that a simple, powerful call to action can still cut through the clutter more powerfully than ever before. There's a paradox of connection that as audiences, we've never been, even if we were more connected than ever before, we're more fragmented. And while it's not hard to find an audience somewhere out there, it's harder to find a mass audience than it has been before. And third, there's a paradox of control. The fact that for CEOs, for organizations, I went to business school, and many managers are trained in business school to be control freaks. I don't know if you use the same phrase in the UK, but we're trained to prize control. But here we are in an environment where control is essential in terms of controlling what we say, but control is absolutely impossible when it comes to controlling what others say, even when they work for us, because the reality is in the network society, everybody is a communicator. And so our argument is that we have to shift the paradigm from focusing managers on control to instead focusing managers on influence. Alongside all that, there's a paradox in our profession. The fact that in many quarters, if you look at the way public relations is portrayed in popular media and popular culture, it tends to be either evil, as is depicted here by Aaron Eckhart and Thank You for Smoking, or this Twitter account I found recently. There's actually a Twitter account called Evil PR Guy, and some wise guy says, isn't calling yourself an evil PR guy a double negative? So that's one image of PR. So it's either this or we're portrayed like this. Here's another website I found recently. Roxy Moon is the PR chick. Don't put off your PR any longer, says Roxy, call me. Sort of akin to Samantha Jones of Sex and the City, who was also a public relations practitioner. So it's very challenging when the media are filled with portrayals of public relations in this way, because the reality is never has what we do been more critical, more essential for organizations, when, as Anne said, so much of the value of organizations is resting in intangibles such as reputation. We really need to stop having others define who we are and what we do, and define it ourselves. That was the spirit behind the Stockholm Accords in 2010 and the spirit behind the Melbourne Mandate in 2012. We thought we would stop for a moment and just see if there are any questions about our introduction.
Hello, this is Pamela Ranta coming in again. Do feel free to type in your questions and we can take them now. And we'll also, of course, be taking some questions at the end.
Okay, so
no questions, well, I'd perhaps like to...
Happy to take questions in either scenario. See that we have somebody type in here. Oh, okay, that's just a thank you. All right, well, we'll press on. And there's another spot for questions in a few minutes, so we'll keep it moving on. So the other thing that we did is we asked, we wanted, in kicking off the Melbourne Mandate, we wanted to make it a consultation, or we wanted to make it a real dialogue. And so it really was a process that began a full year before the Public Relations Forum in Melbourne, and it started with a simple question. What do leaders of the world's public relations professional associations think? And Anne is going to address that question, or tell you how we address that question.
Well, it's worth just reflecting that actually this journey began in 2010 because there is a narrative here that the Global Alliance is building. And just to again thank Tony Muzzi-Falcone, who's on the call with us, because Tony was very much the powerhouse behind generating the Stockholm Accords, which was the first platform in common, if you like, for advocacy for the profession around the world. And the idea was to provide something for practitioners who could explain to others who weren't so familiar with the work of public relations and the contribution that it could make, to provide something for them to explain to others what the importance and contribution that public relations could make to organizations. So the idea of a communicative organisation is really rooted, as it says here, in the stakeholder governance model. And if you think about it, really, it's what others, or what your stakeholders say about you, that determines really the conversations that are going on around you. And the Stockholm Accords involved, again, delegates from across the world in 29 countries coming together to determine 6 principles, and these are they. The first one is sustainability. So this is really, if you like, the baseline for the contribution of public relations within organisations, but also as organisations accept their responsibilities to society. And therefore, sustainability, if the world isn't sustainable, if society isn't sustainable, well, there aren't going to be organisations, is a key element to this and the first building block. So that's about balancing today's needs with tomorrow's needs, and the transformational activity that organisations can include in their portfolio, if they like, to ensure that we have a sustainable future, and the requirement for them to move from a traditional model where they consume and use resources to one where they transform resources and look after the good of the planet at the end of the day. The second building block of the Stockholm Accords was around governance, and it took the stakeholder model, as I mentioned before, very much as the basis for governance, that people take a stake in an organisation, and an organisation has to be responsible to and accountable to a range of stakeholders, not just to those who pull the financial strings. And we have a profound role to play here as communicators, because society has expectations which we need to plug into and respond to, and there are big communicative dimensions there. In the management sphere, well, really management has to listen, and it has to make informed decisions. So again, the idea of communications being the bridge to listen, and also to give to management a perspective on what stakeholder expectations are, so that they can make informed decisions, is profoundly important here. Internal communications, as I mentioned before, is becoming more important, and a holistic approach to communication which regards the internal community as quite as important, if not more important, than the external community, is all part of building a sustainable organisation. And internal communications, as we know, is an area of professional expertise, increasingly in demand, and that responsible organisations take incredibly seriously. The tandem to that, of course, is a requirement for us to be expert in external communication. This is about relationship building and building enduring and sustained relationships. And then there has to be an alignment between internal and external communication, and communication coordination, therefore, is the 6th pillar of the Stockholm Accords. These 6 pillars can be divided into 2 areas of where we add value, really. There is societal and organisational value in the top 3, as you can see, but also we add operational value and make organisations more effective and efficient if we undertake the bottom 3 powerfully and effectively.
We wanted to build on the achievements of Stockholm and the unanimous adoption of the Stockholm Accords that Anne has just introduced to you. And so in thinking about Melbourne, we identified, as I think is a best practice in any public consultation, some process values, some values to guide the process. And these were the ones which we felt were important. That we do this in a way that's completely transparent and open, warts and all, and there were warts along the way. But at the same time, that we try to show some leadership in this, and you'll see in a moment what I mean by that in terms of identifying key themes and focusing on the themes that we also felt were most important, and driving the dialogue with ideas rather than simply waiting for the ideas to come up. Providing opportunities for grassroots participation, ensuring that while naturally there had to be some leadership and we wanted to bring together groups of leading academics and practitioners to lead the process and drive the intellectual content, we also wanted to make it open to all. And finally, a sense of empowerment, setting up working groups as done for the Stockholm model. We wanted to empower the working groups to find their own path, and then, of course, at the end of the process, we had to reconcile those various strands. So we started at a brainstorming session. I apologize, that should say November 2011, and we identified a year beforehand various possibilities. And you'll see, of course, the three pillars of the Melbourne Mandate, which we'll talk about in a few minutes: organizational listening, the definition of organizational character, and the understanding of responsibility as three key themes of the mandate. But we also looked at a series of other things as well, which we factored into the initial consultation. So the next step was to do a survey where we asked leaders of our members, the world's major public relations and communication management industry associations, what they believe some of the key priorities were in terms of the role and value of public relations and advocacy priorities for our profession. This was the result of the survey. They identified in the survey from the subset of options which we presented earlier. Number one was the application of ethics to public relations, and I would say also to business decisions. Very close behind, reputation and stakeholder research, understanding an organization's environment. And then you'll see some other issues there: definition of character, building a listening culture, integrating mainstream and social media. And so we had to think, how would we incorporate these priorities in our framework? The other question, or another question we asked, was about keys to advocacy for public relations, and we threw out various possibilities, or we put out various possibilities. Number one, not surprisingly, the importance of showing the value of public relations to modern organizations, but also the fact that we shouldn't just be talking to one another. We should be talking to stakeholders outside the profession if we are to get anywhere with this advocacy. It's somewhat obvious perhaps, but it really rung true how important this was to our global community. Involvement of both practitioners and academics, the importance of showing not just an organizational value but a societal value, and a little bit less support for the idea of working towards a global definition of public relations, which was something our American friends tried to do in the Public Relations Society of America a year and a half ago. It generated a lot of heat and a very interesting process, but I think the sense in our consultation was that was not as high a priority for the Global Alliance. So the next step was developing an abstract for public comment, where we identified three major pillars for the Melbourne Mandate, and those were these three. The definition of organizational character, and you see some of the strands that are embedded there: organizational DNA, values, leadership culture, the idea of influencing a reputation and a brand. In the bottom right, developing a culture of listening. And what was interesting is that we went back and forth with the name for this strand of the Melbourne Mandate. For a while it was called listening and engagement, and for a while it was called culture, but we ended up with listening because we felt that a lot of organizations, judging from what we heard in the consultation, a lot of organizations are doing engagement reasonably well, or at least they think they're doing it very well, but that they're not as sophisticated as they could be or should be in the judgment of our professional community in the way that they're listening, and are they truly turning all communicators for the organization, whether or not those communicators work in public relations? Are you truly empowering everybody to help with organizational listening, the detection of both risk and opportunity? And of course, the reporting strand is embedded therein. And finally, responsibility. This is where we captured the priority of our stakeholders around ethics, corporate citizenship, sustainability. The idea of shared value is all embedded there. So we identified a series of working groups, and we have two of those working group chairs here on the call today. Anne was co-chair of one of the working groups, the one on organizational character. Tony Musi-Falcone reprised his leadership in a different way this time, and he was co-chair of the one around responsibility. And what was a real strength of the process is that every working group had both practitioners and academics. We had every continent in the world represented, and so their priority between June and October was developing their own draft text, and of course, along the way, we posted the work for comment in September 2012.
That the Global Alliance was also undertaking a major project for Enel, which is Italy's largest energy company, because there were some key questions being asked in the Enel research around the role of public relations and communications, and they were seeking to benchmark their own corporate communications department against the best of the rest, really. And this gave us an opportunity, really, to get an external perspective from senior managers outside our group and from senior managers who are not public relations experts on the role of public relations within organizations. And the results of the Enel report were fascinating. First of all, the range of companies, as you can see, was very diverse, and therefore they're coming from all sorts of backgrounds, whether it be banking or fast-moving consumer goods, and in all sorts of countries, including Brazil, as you can see. But they did align, really, around some core themes, and these are senior people, including CEOs, who believe that there is a particular role for public relations. First of all, they believed that public relations should be placed at a high level of management. And this is crucially important because they see communications and public relations having a core role to play in governance. In other words, being the true north of the company and keeping them on track and making sure that they're responsible and responsive to the stakeholder community that I mentioned earlier. And it was important as well that those public relations specialists were not just public relations and communication specialists. They had a profound understanding, for example, of the financials of the organization, of the operations of the organization, and a familiarity and an ability to contribute strategic inputs, not just around communication and public relations in discussions with senior management. These organizations also believe that reputation evolves and it's a collaborative thing, that as it's co-produced really as reputation, as you listen to others and what they're saying about you, and as you work with them, and as you take the temperature through social media and so on, then you can react and interact accordingly, and that's really important. This is an iterative process, and your brand is built over a period of time as you respond and input in an ongoing conversation, and dialogue is key to this. They also found that it was very important that communications and public relations was regarded to be sort of on message globally, but this doesn't mean that it's straitjacketed. It means that there is, if you like, a DNA to the communication and public relations activities, but there is a deep sensitivity to the countries and cultures in which the organisation is operating. There was a high priority put on to measuring the effectiveness of public relations, and this is not just about the effectiveness of campaigns, but how public relations contributes to the effectiveness of organisations as a whole, and therefore how public relations can contribute to measuring, if you like, the way that organisations are judged by a whole range of stakeholders. And if you think about it, reputation is an absolute measure of performance. It is, because your current reputation is what people judge your performance to be. And therefore, clearly, public relations has a role to play in organisational evaluation. And we also found that there was an emphasis on professional development. And the leaders, particularly of these big organisations and the departments of public relations, were passionately involved in developing communications and public relations expertise internally, but also enabling others external to them with communication skills so that the dialogue could be profitable and worthwhile and informed and enlightened, which is very important if you're going to get that ongoing dialogue. And really the summary of all these discussions with these core constituent companies was that organisations are looking for a new kind of legitimacy. It's not them trying to impose their will on the world and trying to fight for, if you like, a legitimacy. It is a legitimacy that is given to them because their license to operate is supported and, in fact, advocated for by stakeholders. That there's a new kind of influence here which is not built on dominance, if you like, of the public discourse, but which is built around collaboration and cooperation, and where other people and their influence is far more important than you as an organisation. And then a new kind of communication is required, which is not just about getting your message out. And how often do we still see that language in our own profession about what are our key messages? It's about listening, and it's about dialogue, and it's about having negotiated solutions which come about through communication. And those were very powerful insights that we gained from the NL research. So just pause there and ask for your comments or questions about whether or not the process that we went through was a useful one from your point of view. Did it have legitimacy? And because we need to learn all the time, are there better ways that we can do this in the future?
Right. Anne and Daniel, thank you very much indeed for your incredibly interesting presentation, which actually, interestingly, followed on from a launch I went to this morning at the Reputation Institute. It's their latest RepTrack survey, and it was very much saying this is about concepts, this is about listening, this is about the intangible assets. It's not about the things that you produce, it's about the way you're perceived to produce them and how you behave. Incredibly important. We've got one quick question here from Evandro Oliveira. Does the communicative organisation that you present relate to the model of MODAF 2006? And then if there aren't any other questions from our participants, I've got a couple of questions that I'd like to ask you. So the first, could you answer Evandro's question? Do we know what the model of MODAF is?
No, I can't answer it because I don't know MODAF's model. So if Andrew could share that, then we can respond. Well, I can respond to that. Dan may know it very well.
The origin of the model, and in the Stockholm, Melbourne model really built on the Stockholm model. And to Tony's point, which he makes in the chat that I imagine others can see, is that the Stockholm Accords define the communicative organization as one that recognizes horizontality, and that communication is a tool for developing stakeholder relationships. But the organization owning the process, with public relations facilitating it with its resources and its human resources and the skills of its people. I'm sure there are many different intellectual strands that the academics and professionals involved in Stockholm brought to the table, and of course Anne and I were both part of that. We each chaired working groups for Stockholm, but I'm not familiar with anybody specifically bringing the MODAP model. So we're happy to continue. We have one more chunk here where we're going to speak to you explicitly about the three pillars of the mandate. Pamela, should we proceed to that? Okay, Anne, over to you.
Okay, thank you. So the Melbourne Mandate, really the prospectus was to come up with an agenda, an advocacy agenda for the communicative organisation for 2012, and we hope not just for 2012 but maybe for 2013 as well, and 14. And there are three pillars to this really, as you can see here. The first one is character, which is about DNA and values and leadership. The second one is about listening, and I've noted your question here, Tony, about whether or not there are university courses in listening. I can't answer for others, but I know in my own university we're going to do exactly that, partly as a response to the Stockholm Accord and Melbourne Mandates, because they're now embedded within our own curriculum here at the university, and we're going to run courses on active listening and listening, and that's regarded as crucially important. And then the third pillar is about responsibility, ethics and citizenship, etc. So Dan and I are going to split discussion of these, but I'm just going to touch on the first one, which is character and values, which is one that I was privileged to lead the development of with James Wright, who's an Australian, and I have to say, a former student of mine. So it was fantastic to see a leader of the profession now who's come up through education, and James was more than my match, I can say, in the contributions that he made to our discussions. So just talking about character then, this we feel that really the idea of communication and public relations helping to shape the character of the organisation is absolutely key, because we see this really as public relations contributing to shaping the DNA of organisations, and that's a word that we use quite a lot in our discussions. And character, as Lincoln says here, is like a tree, and reputation is its shadow. And unless the character is sound, if a canker grows on the tree, it will eventually, although it might be fuzzy at the beginning, be reflected in the shadow, and the reputation will be affected by that. So you need a solid and true character, and public relations can help to building that. And if reputation is an ultimate judge of organisational performance, it's absolutely a no-brainer that we as public relations professionals should be involved in this. So this rather complicated model was really the sum of our discussions. We feel that public relations can help contribute to the very mission of an organisation. It constantly has to be reviewed, tested, and be seen to be legitimate in the eyes of its stakeholders. And so reasserting and re-examining, constantly reviewing the mission and why an organisation exists, because, as we know, there are some very famous organisations who have ceased to exist simply because they didn't do this. But testing the legitimacy of the organisation is a job for public relations leaders to take on. And then if we look at shaping the character of the organisation, which is really how we do things around here, we see that there are three elements really to this, and three contributions that public relations can make. First of all, looking at values. it's our job to constantly test whether those values are real and lived, and whether or not they have external support. And of course that plays into the legitimacy of the organisation. And there's some deep questions here around how those values are negotiated and whether they're internally agreed with and expressed, and whether they're externally supported. So a key role for us around that area. Leadership as well. Part of our role here is about advising senior leaders on how to model the values and whether or not they're able to inspire support because they are seen to be themselves an enhancement of organisational character, or if they have priorities which actually go against the values which are declared by the organisation. And the important thing to say at this stage is that nobody tells organisations what their values should be. You pick them for yourselves, and therefore it's quite legitimate to be held accountable against them. And leadership have to model those, and part of our role is to ensure that there's no disjoin between the values that are proposed and the values that are lived. And then part of the other element to this whole piece of DNA is around culture. And this is not just about the way that we do things around here and the things that are normally associated with culture, but we think, and this is not a problem for me because of the size of mine, that public relations practitioners should have enormous noses and stick their nose into things like processes, structures, behaviours and ways of working within an organisation, and that means strain onto other people's territory to make sure that the values are embodied in the very structures and processes that organisations have. And that means that part of our role is not only to ensure that there's alignment there, but that we can create initiatives that actually bring these to life. So the whole thing about helping to shape organisational character is very much our territory, because our whole reason d'etre, if you like, is to enhance, maintain and protect organisational authenticity and integrity, and that's a core role for us. So apart from this highfalutin ambition, if you like, this mandate, we also came up with a practical tool. There's nothing new here. Those of you who do auditing in other areas will know that spidergrams are often used to test various elements and to use to compare the views of groups one against the other, and we can do that for values. And this is actual one for an organisation that we were working with at the time, which shows here how different organisations can plot and evaluate the values of an organisation as they are lived and as they are embodied in their character. So from this we can actually generate an integrity index. We can put metrics against this, and again we've used this practically within organisations for them to get a judgment about whether or not their organisational character is actually lived rather than just, if you like, espoused. This work does actually reflect some work that's been done by the Arthur W. Page Society, where corporate character is again at the heart of one of their recent documents on character and belief, and therefore we feel that we've moved, if you like, the thinking on in the Melbourne Mandate in developing the role of public relations in corporate character.
Okay, so the next phase of the Melbourne Mandate, or the next pillar, is the development of a culture of listening and engagement. You know, to go back to something we talked about on the chat associated with the webinar here, is that everybody would agree, I think, that, and I hope everyone on the call would agree, that communication should always be led by professionals, but that in the network society, where everybody is a communicator at some level, it is important to be able to tap into the listening abilities and opportunities that people throughout the organization have. And so the role of public relations becomes one of, yes, listening ourselves and engaging ourselves and leading that process, but also helping others within the organization across disciplines be better listeners and be more effective at engagement. We all know in our own practices just the power of a story and how symbolism or salience or conflict can propel an organization or an issue into the news or into social media commentary, how it can be fueled by emotion, by advocacy, by the fact that we live in this strange time where the news cycle has never been shorter, but thanks to the internet, the legacy of news has never been longer. And of course, social networks help fuel that even further. So mitigation, obviously anticipating what might happen through effective listening, responding through effective understanding of what is important to the stakeholder, building partnerships with respected third parties who can help add context and dimension to the organization's position and show that it is supported and validated. And finally, a sense of fairness. So many organizations have engagement processes, and often we all know the result of that engagement process is not what some stakeholders may want. It can't be. You can never satisfy everybody. But the view that we gain through this process is that it is so critically important that your audiences see the process as fair and ethical, and if they do, they're far more likely to understand and accept a result that they did not advocate. Obviously, watching conversation is very critical, and here's a tool that we use for my own practice here in Canada, social listening tool to look at conversation at the high level, what sort of words are dominating the conversation. And I don't know if you can see this clearly, but you see in this example there are words change, impact, jeopardize, uncertainty, stakeholders, stall, fight. This was a real example from one of our public sector clients, and you can imagine that dealing with that was a pretty good clue that there were going to be some challenges and that we had to dig deeper in listening a little bit further. And I believe that in listening to stakeholders, there are a few dimensions that are particularly important to think about. The stakeholders' level of engagement, the stakeholders' level of influence, and the stakeholders' level of support for the organization or for its proposition or product. And so you see here a snapshot of a stakeholder who is likely going to be a problem for us, right? They're not highly engaged yet. They are highly influential, but they are very negative in terms of their support. And so simple tools like this can be very effective in helping to listen. The other thing that's important is choosing the right mode for listening and engagement. This is one that I use in my professional practice quite regularly at our company here, and that's it's developed by the International Association for Public Participation, and they really identify 5 levels of stakeholder, of public participation. And if you look at the bottom line here, it's really framed by the level of stakeholder influence. So a low level of stakeholder influence, well, perhaps you can get away with simply informing and educating them. Obviously, at a high level of influence, you really have to partner with them and co-create with them. Finally, I just want to put a caveat on this that Dr. Mohan Dutta shared with us at the academic colloquium, and it made an impact on me because he said we often use the term dialogue to describe processes that are not dialogic. And he asked the question, are we fostering discursive spaces that get us closer to truth and justice? And I thought that was a very powerful question because we all experience dialogue, either dialogues that we lead as professionals or dialogue in which we participate as consumers or citizens or in other roles we may have. Sometimes we get the sense that the dialogue is really just for show. It's not designed to change anything. The organization is not flexible in its opinion. And so it really calls to question, what is the purpose of that dialogue if nobody wants to change their position or would consider changing their position? And I think that was a very important caveat that he placed on this idea of listening and engagement.
So the third leg of the stool for the Melbourne Mandate then was understanding and instilling responsibility. And this was quite a long section because responsibility has to be discharged at societal, organisational, professional and individual level. I'm not going to go into all those areas in detail, but I'm going to capture one or two of the key themes around here. If we think about it, responsibility really emanates from two core principles. The first is that the license to operate is derived from the value that organisations create for its stakeholders, including society, and society I do regard as a stakeholder. And the second principle is that organisation is valued directly to its reputation, and that is sustained by building trust, by acting with integrity, by communicating appropriately, etc., etc. So if we just look at the level of societal responsibility and organisational responsibility in a combined way, I mentioned earlier the International Integrated Reporting Council and their work, and the 6 levels of capital that they talk about: financial, manufactured, human, intellectual, natural and social. And the way that an organisation should be adding value to those capitals if it's going to discharge its responsibilities properly. And it was very interesting in the discussions today how integration really requires a holistic approach and thinking about the organisation, and this is mediated through detailed dialogue and conversation in all these areas. And therefore we have responsibilities as public relations professionals to make sure that at that societal level, for example, we have open, honest and accessible discussions and processes as advocated by Mohan Dutta, which empower people, sometimes who are not very powerful, to be able to contribute to deciding the sort of society and the responsibilities that organisations are required to discharge as far as broader society is concerned. And if we think about organisational responsibility, then maybe it's time to think about a new corporate business model. I think some corporate businesses are having a new business model forced upon them at the moment, kicking and screaming. I look at some of the organisations here in the UK who have been in the news recently, and it has just not been acceptable. Their behaviours, you'll probably know what I'm talking about, fixing of the LIBOR rate, etc., etc., which are not acceptable practice. And it was very interesting that the new chief executive of Barclays Bank, which is one of our enormous banks here in the UK, his first public pronouncement was, we must return to being a values-based organisation. If we lose our mandate to operate from society, then we as an organisation have no right to exist. So interesting that he was in many ways reaffirming the requirement to come up with a new corporate business model. So as Paul Holmes from the Holmes Report said, there are major decisions and implications for any business decision. And again, interestingly, there was one individual yesterday in the commentary that was made at the launch of the Integrated Reporting Initiative who said, all I'm interested in is financial return. And he was quickly challenged by other people saying, if you believe that financial return can be seen in the silo these days, you're living in the last century, because all the capitals that we've mentioned, social capital, intellectual capital, actually have to work together to yield a financial return. So organisational responsibility, responsible decision making, involving people, accountability, and being able to capture the value of relationships is crucially important when we talk about the responsibility of organisations, because reputational implications of not holding good in any of these areas are profound. I keep promising myself to do a piece of research which is to look at those chief executives in the last couple of years who have lost their jobs, and just to ask the question, what was the reason they lost their job? Was it because of financial malfeasance, or was it because of some other reason that had a profound impact on reputation? I think I know the answer to that question. I just need to capture the data to support the answer to that. And if you think about the mistakes that some high-profile chief executives have made, it's because they don't understand the context in which they're making their remarks, and they don't understand the communicative implications of their remarks and their actions. And therefore, there is comfort there for a growing realization that responsibility, organizational and societal responsibility, is intimately bound up with their ability to have communication competence as a core capability within their organizations. And of course, professional and personal responsibility for those who are going to step up to the plate and take such a role as organizational seer and mentor. These responsibilities for us to be up to date professionally and to take due regard to our personal responsibilities as professional communicators have never been more important. So are we able to rationalize ourselves and display to others our thinking processes, and are we able to say they are full of integrity ourselves is a big challenge to us as professional communicators. So we were very pleased with the endorsements that we got from others outside the Melbourne Mandate. I'm not saying at all, and neither would Dan claim, that this was a perfect process or a perfect outcome. But at least it seemed to have some resonance with some of our core stakeholders, including important luminaries such as James Grunnig, who was able to agree that the mandate was a suitable platform for us to seek advocacy.
Just to wrap up here, and apologies, we're a couple of minutes behind time, but we're just 60 seconds or so away from conclusion. Just want to close by just speaking a little bit about questions that we believe that all organizations and professionals should ask themselves in the current environment. And I guess I want to start with the idea that public relations is about more than communication. We often get into this tiresome debate about what do we call ourselves. Do we call ourselves public relations or do we call ourselves communication? And I go back to the words of Arthur Page, industry pioneer, who had an axiom. He said public perception of an organization is determined 90% by what it does and only 10% by what it says. And so while communication is obviously our process, our means to an end, a huge part of what we do, it can't be the only thing we do if we're truly to be effective in influencing our clients, their reputations, and the value of their brands. And so it's important that we think too about Harold Burson's recent comment, where he said, at first they told us, here's the message, go deliver it. Then it became, what should the message be? Now it's, what should we do? That's what we are being asked to help answer that question. So we have to ask ourselves, what value can we add beyond the pillars in the Melbourne Mandate? We have to ask ourselves, are we being effective in defining the character of our organizations? And what is the character of our organizations? And what values are guiding our decisions and our communication? We have to ask, are we building cultures of listening and engagement? We have to ask, are we truly understanding our responsibility at all those levels, the personal, the professional, the organizational, and the societal? Do we have people in our organizations who understand business, who understand government, who understand the consumer? We believe that the Melbourne Mandate is just the beginning of our profession's quest to come up with the answers to these questions, but we hope it's a useful contribution to the debate, to the dialogue, to giving professionals both an advocacy platform and also some we hope, helpful tools, such as the ones that Anne shared with you. The world sometimes feels a bit broken these days, and we believe, though, that there's never been a greater need for public relations to help bring about economic recovery and political freedom and technological advancement and social justice. And that, in order to do this, we need to elevate our profession, and that's what the Melbourne Mandate was all about. So thank you so much. We are grateful for the time today, and we're happy to answer any final questions.
Thank you so much for your time today and for sharing such an incredible wealth of information with us. We've got a lot to take away. I should reassure people that we will put the presentation on our own CIPR web tomorrow. However, if I may just ask you one very quick question, one question each. We've heard a lot about the holistic importance, about listening, about engagement, and Daniel, it was a relief to know that storytelling is still important. That was echoed by the reputation people this morning. A powerful story is a powerful story, no matter what age we live in. So my question to both of you is, much of what we've been hearing this afternoon is very high level. Can you both give us one tip that we as PR professionals can take away as an actual to-do action? Just one tip each would be really helpful to bring it from these terrific high-level concepts, which are incredibly important, and I love that character model, down to actually what can we as PR people do right now?
Well, I'll kick off. I think one very concrete I'd suggest that Melbourne Mandate principles resonate with you, and if you like this model, I think that it can be helpful to use the Melbourne Mandate as a point of discussion internally within the organization, and asking the questions of executives to whom we report, or executives of our client organizations. If these are best practices agreed globally among professionals from 30 different countries with so much input, are we following these best practices? That's point one. And point two is I think professionals can look at the Melbourne Mandate principles, and I'd encourage you to read the full document because there's a lot more than we've been able to present today, and use it as a guide for their own professional development. And I think that's part two of the conversation with one's executives. If I need to develop as a professional, I can use some of the principles and the skills that are prescribed in the Melbourne Mandate as a bit of a professional development guide for me. And so that's my quick suggestion.
Daniel, thank you.
Okay, and from me, I think it's play a short game and play a long game. The short game is make sure that your professional skills are absolutely honed and keep up to date and be the best you possibly can, because that gives you personal credibility. And the long game is to think big for public relations. The world is ours. The Melbourne Mandate gives a prospectus for an exciting future for us. So we should work too on honing our skills so that we can be the practitioners that CEOs want us to be, fully participating at board level